A president picks up the phone, says one sentence to a radio host, and by morning the price of oil is moving on 3 continents. That is what happened this week. Not a rumor, not a leak. A direct, on-air threat from the Oval Office aimed at a mountain most of the world had never heard of. Somewhere under that mountain, Iran has spent 6 years digging. Somewhere above it, American satellites have spent 6 years watching. And now, for the first time, Washington has said out loud what it plans to do about it. The consequence arrived within hours. Naval traffic through one of the most important waterways on Earth slowed to a crawl. Insurance rates on oil tankers spiked. Gulf governments began quiet, urgent phone calls to each other, trying to figure out whether they were about to be dragged into someone else's war for the second time in 2 years. And underneath all of it sits one question. Nobody in Washington, Tehran, or Tel Aviv can yet answer with certainty. Can this mountain actually be destroyed? Or has Iran finally built something American bunker busters cannot reach? Stay with the story, because before the end, you will understand exactly why the single underground facility may decide whether this war stays contained or becomes something far larger. To understand why one mountain matters this much, you have to go back to a summer night 5 years earlier, when an explosion tore through a centrifuge workshop at Iran's Natanz nuclear complex. Iran never officially confirmed who was responsible. A previously unknown group claimed credit, but intelligence officials, speaking anonymously to Western reporters, and independent nuclear analysts studying the wreckage, reached the same conclusion. This was sabotage, almost certainly carried out with Israeli involvement, and it had just destroyed the only facility in the country capable of mass-producing advanced centrifuges. Rebuilding that capability from scratch, experts estimated, would take well over a year. Iran's answer was to go underground, literally. Within months, construction began on a new complex tunneled directly into a mountain a little more than a mile from the original site. Iranian officials described it publicly as a replacement assembly hall, but the scale of the digging told a different story. Engineers cut deep chambers into solid rock, hardened tunnel entrances, and built a facility analysts would eventually judge to be buried at least 100 meters beneath the surface, deep enough, some believed, to sit beyond the reach of even the most powerful conventional weapons in the American arsenal. The West gave it a nickname that stuck, Pickaxe Mountain. For years, the site sat in a strange kind of limbo. It was never struck. International inspectors were never granted access. Iran refused to explain what exactly was happening inside. And when war finally reached Iran's nuclear program in June of last year, when American stealth bombers dropped bunker-busting bombs on Fordo and struck the Natanz enrichment halls directly above this same mountain, Pickaxe itself was left untouched. It survived the first war entirely intact. That fact alone should tell you something about how differently military planners have always treated this particular target. Now fast forward to the present. The ceasefire that followed that earlier war did not hold. Fighting resumed at the end of February this year, drawing the United States and Israel back into direct conflict with Iran for a second time. And in the past week, that renewed war has escalated sharply. American forces have carried out consecutive nights of strikes across Iranian territory, hitting coastal defense systems, missile storage sites, drone facilities, and naval infrastructure at ports, including Bandar Abbas. Iranian state media reported explosions across multiple southern provinces and islands in the Gulf, though officials in Tehran have released few details about casualties or the true scope of the damage. Washington's stated objective, according to U.S. Central Command, is to dismantle Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel through which a significant share of the world's oil still moves every single day. Iran has not absorbed these strikes quietly. In the days since fighting resumed, Iranian forces have launched retaliatory drone and missile attacks toward American allies and interests across the region, targeting Bahrain, striking near Jordan, and hitting tankers linked to the United Arab Emirates, an attack that reportedly killed one crew member and wounded several others. A drone strike also reportedly hit an oil facility inside Kuwait. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has claimed a string of additional successes against military and infrastructure targets, though independent verification of those specific claims remains limited, and analysts caution that Iranian state media has a documented history of overstating results on the battlefield. This is the moment the president chose to raise the stakes even further. In an interview with a conservative radio host earlier this week, President Trump was asked directly whether the United States would demand inspector access to Pickaxe Mountain before agreeing to any new deal with Iran. He said yes. Then he went well beyond the question that had actually been asked. He described the site as a possible target for what he called a shot right at the front door. Then, later in the same conversation, he made it sound less like a threat and more like a plan already set in motion. "We're going to take out Pickaxe Mountain," he said. "Tell the Iranians to be ready." It is worth pausing here because the language itself tells a story. In the space of a single interview, the president moved from calling the mountain a possible target to promising he would take it out entirely, to saying the U.S. would probably give it a shot relatively soon. That is not the language of a finalized battle plan. It is the language of a threat still being shaped in real time. One designed as much to pressure Iran back to the negotiating table as to describe an operation that has already been ordered. As of the most recent reporting available, Pickaxe Mountain has not been struck. Satellite imagery from early July shows its tunnel entrance is still open, construction still ongoing, and no visible sign of an attack. Whether that changes in the coming days is, right now, the single most consequential open question in this entire conflict. So why would American planners hesitate even after making the threat public? Because destroying Pickaxe Mountain may be a fundamentally harder problem than the strikes that came before it. Last year's attack on Fordo relied on a very specific American weapon, a 14,000-kilogram bunker buster, the largest non-nuclear bomb in the U.S. arsenal, dropped from stealth bombers in a coordinated overnight raid. That bomb does not explode on contact. It survives the impact, drives itself downward through rock and reinforced concrete, and only detonates once it has burrowed deep enough to matter. Even so, independent assessments of how far it can actually penetrate vary widely. Some analysts put the effective depth at around 60 meters of earth, others closer to 18 meters through solid concrete. Pickaxe Mountain, by most current estimates, sits deeper than that, which raises an uncomfortable possibility for American war planners. The weapon that worked on Fordo might not be enough here. There is a second complication, and it may matter just as much as the depth of the rock. Nuclear analysts who have studied similar Iranian tunnel complexes point out that airstrikes on hardened facilities rarely succeed through the front door at all. In earlier strikes on comparable sites, the decisive damage came from targeting narrower, more exposed weak points. Ventilation shafts, above-ground power lines feeding into the mountain, the tunnel openings themselves, rather than trying to punch straight through solid rock. Satellite images of Pickaxe Mountain appear to show a probable ventilation shaft under construction near its eastern entrance, along with power infrastructure running into the site from above ground. If American targeters follow the same playbook used elsewhere, those vulnerabilities, not the mountain's thickness, may end up deciding the outcome. And that leads to the deeper, more uncomfortable question hanging over this entire story. Even if Pickaxe Mountain is struck, will anyone actually know what happened underground? After the strikes on Fordo last year, the true extent of the damage remained genuinely disputed for weeks. Inspectors were never allowed inside. Analysts were left comparing satellite images of collapsed tunnel entrances against competing claims from Washington and Tehran, unable to say with confidence how much of the facility survived intact. If that uncertainty followed a strike on a site the world already understood in detail, it is difficult to imagine getting a clear answer any faster here. On a facility, international inspectors have never been permitted to enter even once. While attention is focused on one mountain, the war around it has kept widening. This week alone, President Trump announced the reinstatement of a naval blockade on Iranian shipping, floated the idea of charging foreign vessels a toll to pass through the Strait of Hormuz under American protection, then abandoned that specific proposal within 48 hours in favor of a different arrangement, trade and investment commitments from Gulf states instead. Strikes have hit not only military infrastructure, but, according to local officials in Iran, areas near the port city of Bushehr, home to the country's only civilian nuclear power plant, in an attack the United States has not directly claimed. The Treasury Department has simultaneously moved to choke off a sanctions evasion network tied to Iranian oil exports. And in Washington, officials have formally notified Congress that military action against Iran began on July 7th, with American forces, in the administration's own words, postured to take further action as necessary. Meanwhile, one regional power has conspicuously stayed on the sidelines. Despite fighting Iran directly in the war that reignited in February, Israel has not visibly participated in this latest wave of American strikes. According to regional reporting, some Israeli assessments now treat the current escalation as a precursor to something larger still to come, a belief that this round of fighting, however intense, may not be the final chapter. Whether Israel re-enters the fight directly and under what circumstances remains one of the open variables that could reshape everything in the days ahead. For ordinary people living far from any front line, the practical consequences are already measurable. Shipping through the Strait of Hormuz has slowed dramatically since the war resumed at the end of February, and attacks on commercial vessels have continued even in the past 24 hours, with tankers struck and, in at least one case, a foreign national killed. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil typically moves through this single channel. Every additional day of disruption ripples outward into fuel prices, shipping insurance, and the calculations of governments thousands of miles away, who have no direct stake in the conflict, but every stake in its economic aftershocks. So where does this actually go from here? One path leads toward a strike on Pickaxe Mountain in the coming days, an operation that, if it happens, would immediately become the most technically ambitious attack of this entire war, and one whose true results might not be confirmed for weeks, if ever. A second path leads toward a negotiated de-escalation, with diplomats on both sides quietly working toward inspector access, and a new understanding, even as public rhetoric stays maximalist. Analysts who study the region are notably split on which is more likely. With some warning, this could settle into a drawn-out, multi-year confrontation, rather than resolve cleanly in either direction. What almost everyone agrees on is this: the answer will not come from another speech or another interview. It will come from what happens, or doesn't happen, over that mountain in the next several days. There is something almost fitting about a war this large turning on a single piece of geography that most of the world cannot even picture. A mountain nobody was allowed to inspect, a weapon whose true reach is still debated by the people who built it, a president who described the same operation 3 different ways in the space of one conversation. That is not the language of certainty. It is the language of a decision still being made in real time, with global consequences attached to whichever way it finally lands. And so the question this story leaves behind is not simply whether Pickaxe Mountain gets struck. It is what happens to everyone downstream of that decision. The sailors moving through the strait, the families in the provinces already living under nightly strikes, the governments recalculating their own security with every new headline. Once a war, this unpredictable, reaches its next chapter. If you want to understand where this goes next, before the headlines catch up, make sure you're subscribed. Drop your take in the comments on whether you think Pickaxe Mountain gets hit this week, and like this video so more people can follow this story as it breaks.